Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Thaddeus Metz, and we're going to talk about meaning in life. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good to see you and glad to be here.
All right, so first question. What is meaning in life, and do you distinguish it from meaning of life?
So, yeah, professional philosophers now standardly draw a distinction between meaning in life on the one hand and the meaning of life in a narrow sense on the other. And the distinction concerns the bearer, which life it is that has or lacks the meaning. And when we speak of meaning in life, we're speaking about the meaningfulness of the life of an individual, and typically an individual person. In contrast, if we're speaking of the meaning of life, again, in that narrow sense, we are talking about the point of the human race as a whole, the human species, or perhaps even the point of the universe, but something quite a bit bigger than the life of an individual person. The past 200 years or so, I think there's been a shift in philosophical reflection, whereas previously in much of the medieval and modern era, quite a lot of the focus was on the meaning of life. But that has died down, and I think probably that's because of the rise of naturalism or atheism, and the suspicion that there might well not be a meaning of life. That is, there might not be, for example, a God who has created the human race for a purpose. And so, in the absence of meaningfulness of life, philosophers have tended to inquire as to whether there might not still be meaning in life.
Okay, yeah, I think that was a good distinction there. So, can you kind of elaborate on, I guess, the relationship between theism and meaning of life? Is the idea that the only way that life could have meaning, like life itself or human life itself could have meaning, is if there were some sort of God that created us for a purpose?
That's the standard view, is where a meaning of life would consist of, is a kind of theist picture. But I myself and some colleagues have argued that's not essential, that it's conceivable that we could have a meaningful human species, or at least large swaths of humanity that have a significant existence in the absence of a theistic picture. And so two plausible suggestions, I think, are one, if human beings did quite a lot to try to communicate and perhaps meet with an intelligent alien species, that would make the race plausibly, or at least some large subset of humanity at a given time, meaningful. And then if human beings did a good job of advancing justice across the globe, that too, if it were at least in some kind of coordinated effort, it would be plausible, I think, to ascribe meaning to humanity as opposed to individual humans.
Okay. So then let's get a little bit more into what constitutes meaning. Like, what is the meaning of meaning? So you mentioned example just now about us, fighting for justice and creating a more just society. And you were saying that if we were to do that, that would contribute to the meaning of life or the meaning in life.
It's a plausible candidate for a naturalist approach to the meaningfulness of life. I'm inclined to think something grander than individuals could conceivably have a meaning in virtue of those kinds of things. When we're talking about meaning in life, I think it's useful to try to start defining the phrase or analyzing the concept. And at least at the individual level, I think it's useful to think in terms of a cluster of closely related ideas. So I think analytically, when we speak of meaning in life, at least professional philosophers have in mind ideas like what merits esteem or great esteem in a life, or what merits admiration from a third-person perspective. We could also add in what makes a contribution or a positive contribution, what achieves this purpose that's worth more than simply our own subjective well-being. What would it be to be an author of a compelling or interesting life story? I think there's a cluster of these kinds of properties that is what most of us have in mind when we're inquiring into at least meaning in life. And it helps to demarcate the value from other ones like happiness and morality when we're explicit about these properties.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's such an ambiguous word, right? Like if you asked me what's the meaning, what's meaning in life or what's the meaning of life or something similar to that, I don't think I would have an answer, at least off the top of my head. It seems such a deep, fundamental question in philosophy. But at the same time, it seems obvious to some people when they lack it. I see forums on the internet where people say, I'm, 40 years old and I haven't done anything. I feel like I am a loser. And the entire language of these posts is an acknowledgement that there's a lack of meaning in their lives, and they think that it's bad. Like they want meaning. They want to find it somewhere, you know?
I think, yeah, I think that's right. It's only been the past 25 years that professional philosophers have really devoted a decent amount of time to trying to define the phrase or analyze the concept. I think the cluster I just mentioned to you is pretty good. It would make sense of the kinds of reactions you mentioned. So those folks who are bemoaning a lack of meaning, it's plausible to say, well, they don't see anything in their life that's worthy of great esteem, or they don't think they've made a positive difference, or they haven't achieved anything worth more than their subjective well-being or animal nature, or their life story isn't that compelling or interesting. These strike me as promising ways of capturing the complaint.
Okay. So I think what's interesting is the connection between meaning and maybe achieving something outside of yourself. That sounds quite plausible to me, and I think it makes sense of some of the accounts that I read on the internet about people just not feeling good about their own lives. It's almost like they haven't done anything, right? They haven't accomplished something great. So it's almost like the value that we place on our lives partly depends on if we better humanity in some way.
I think that's a lot of it, but I myself wouldn't put it so starkly. So I think there are ways of relating to yourself that are intuitively meaningful. So I don't think that when we feel pleasure or satisfy desires or do anything that's sort of overlap with animal life, I don't think meaning is to be found there, or at least not very much. But we can exercise certain higher aspects of ourselves and simply in relation to ourselves, where I think there's plausibly some meaning. So, for example, I think overcoming some kind of personality disorder or some kind of neurosis like narcissism, if a person worked really hard and were able to reform his or her character to become more mentally healthy. That need not essentially involve humanity or other people. But I think it would be meaningful in a way that, eating a bowl of ice cream or watching a sitcom would not be.
So is it because they're improving themselves?
I think so. I mean, my own account of meaning is that a lot of it is exhausted by the exercise of our intelligence or our rational nature in a very broad sense. And you can think of neurosis as inhibiting rationality, and the work it would take to fix that to involve quite a lot of the exercise of rationality, quite a lot of effort and sophisticated intelligence. So that's my own account of what's going on, but people have other ones, of course.
Yeah, I was curious to see the relation between your account and this concept of higher goods, higher pleasures, essentially like how it connects to some sort of Aristotelian account of the good, and how closely it depends on us developing our human natures as the rational animal. And it sounds like it's pretty close, right?
It is. I think at least my own view, owes quite a lot to Aristotle and Kant. At least Aristotle didn't think of himself quite as providing an account of meaning in life. Kant also didn't use those terms, at least. and was more, at least in the first instance, interested in an account of morality. But I do think meaningfulness, at least in the first instance, is a feature of human persons. There is recent debate about whether it's possible for animals and infants to have some share of meaning. But I think it's pretty uncontroversial amongst most professional philosophers interested in the topic that, it's really centrally persons who are going to have meaningful lives. And it's plausible to think it's something about their personhood, something about their rational nature, rational capacities that's doing the work.
I don't know if you're aware of American politics, but there's this guy, J.D. Vance, who might become the next vice president. And I think he was on a podcast where he talked about, people not having kids. And he comes from a more conservative background, and he thinks that, I don't know exactly what words he used, but that it's better to have kids. Maybe it's more fulfilling. Your life is better, right? And I think there was some response by some people saying like, look, like I'm perfectly fine without kids, there was a video of this woman who might have been like 40 or something, and she was like clubbing, right? She has like alcohol on her hands and she's like clubbing. And then conservatives took that and said, that's sad. If you think that that's a meaningful life, then that's really sad, right? I want to get your opinion on that.
Well, there in a way, there are two issues implicitly here. So one is whether it's meaningful. But the other is whether meaning is something choice-worthy relative to other goods. So I would need a fuller description of the case to know whether the clubbing with the booze is meaningful or not. I mean, suppose there's quite a lot of, I don't know, suppose there's a development of a romantic relationship or closer ties of friendship that are developed in the course of that activity, then it starts to look meaningful to me. But in the absence of that, I mean, suppose it was just a person dancing alone, getting drunk alone, and really wasn't having any, we imagine there isn't any social dimension to the dancing, then the meaning starts to slip away for me. But there is still the separate question of, well, should she do it? And I myself don't think that meaning is an overriding, I don't think it's an all-encompassing value, and I also don't think it's an overriding value. I think there are times where it's perfectly sensible to choose, what you might call happiness or subjective well-being instead of meaning. And perhaps dancing alone, getting drunk alone could be one.
I'm trying to understand the connection between meaning and well-being. So my background is more of the philosophy of well-being. And, in the well-being literature, you often hear the discussion about non-instrumental goods, non-instrumental prudential goods. And I'm wondering if that also is closely tied to meaning. So is it possible for someone not to live a meaningful life while still attaining these non-instrumental prudential goods?
Yeah, I think so. And the classic example we get of that comes from Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And we have the thought experiment of the experience machine. This virtual reality device that you can enter for the rest of your life. I think we're supposed to imagine you don't know that you're in it, and you've pre-programmed all the experiences that you would have going forward. You're not actually doing the things that you're experiencing. You're not actually slaying the Black Knight or having a great romance or writing the great American novel or what have you. But you're having the experience of that. That looks like a pretty good candidate to me for a happy life or a satisfied life, even a fulfilling life, at least in some sense. But very few philosophers of meaning in life would count it as a good candidate for meaningfulness. It's a classic example of the absence of meaning.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I understand the experience machine as an objection to hedonism. And I'm not a hedonist. Like, I think that there are other things that are just objectively good for you. So I think loving relationships are good for you, and that wouldn't be present if you're in the experience machine, right? Because then those, you're not actually having those friendships. So I'm imagining someone who's actually living this life. So let's say the typical items on the list. Pleasure. They're really experiencing pleasure. They really do have loving relationships. They really are attaining knowledge, and they actually are achieving things. Like that to me sounds like a meaningful life too.
Yes, and I agree. Once we start thinking of well-being in objective terms, it becomes more difficult to draw a distinction between, well, here's a case of meaning and here's a case of well-being. And yeah, I think most of the cards up my sleeve are going to suppose that well-being is subjective in some way that might not be hedonist. It could be a matter of desire satisfaction or some kind of emotional satisfaction. For any of those accounts, I think we can pretty quickly draw a firm distinction between well-being and meaning. But when we get to objective goods, I agree. It becomes much more difficult. But here are perhaps a couple of cases to suggest that we still have some distinction to draw between the two. The first one is where I sacrifice my objective well-being, however you want to construe it, so that other people's objective well-being, however you want to construe it, is advanced. So imagine there's a net reduction in my objective well-being, but I do that for the sake of other people's objective well-being. That looks to me like, okay, I've defined the case such that I have a loss of objective well-being, but it conceivably could be quite a meaningful choice to make. The second sort of case is where I think sometimes the meaning in our lives is a function not of what happens to us, but of what happens to others. And so I think life would be more meaningful if, for example, the guilty receive the punishment they have coming to them, right? And the guilty receiving the punishment they have coming to them, it doesn't make the people being punished any better off by definition of punishment, probably. And if somebody who's wronged me is punished, I'm not any better off. Particularly, just imagine I'm not even aware of it. Still, I think from some kind of objective perspective, if there's a world in which the guilty, in which justice is done to the guilty and innocent victims, that's a more meaningful world, but doesn't seem to be a function of anyone's well-being.
Interesting. Let's kind of break those two down. So the first one was perhaps you sacrificing your well-being for the sake of others. So that's an example that I'd use to show my students that morality and well-being can be distinct, right? So like jump on the grenade to save friends and stuff like that. So that makes me wonder what the relationship between morality and meaning is. So can you live a moral life and not have a meaningful life? And can you live a meaningful life while being immoral?
Yeah, I think it's very complex. And the debates about the relationship between morality and meaning have become very sophisticated, particularly in the past 5 years. I think myself that that normally, or I guess how would I put it? If you act morally and beyond the call of duty, that's invariably meaningful. You get some meaning credit from doing that. But I don't want to suggest it's the only source of meaning. And I want to accept that there might be other sources of meaning that would give you some reason to be immoral in certain ways. And the classic case that you'll find in the philosophy of life's meaning is that of Gauguin, the artist, who is reputed to have left his wife and child to go to the Polynesian islands to develop his artistic talent. And we're supposed to imagine that he wouldn't have become a great artist had he not left his family in the lurch. I'm not sure whether that happened, but it's a nice sort of case to consider. I myself think, yep, boy, that's immoral, and it's cost him some meaning in respect of his relationships. But I want to grant that some meaning also came from becoming a great artist, and it could well have been enough to give him, all things considered, reason to do it. I myself draw a distinction between different types of immorality. So I think, that wasn't good. Ditching your family is not good. um, but I think there's certain kinds of immorality that's just so bad that it wipes out the possibility of obtaining meaning thereby. So if we take the artist example again, if you're an artist and you go around kidnapping people, and killing them in gruesome ways and taking their blood and using their blood as the paint. Now I'm starting to think, no, there's no meaning here at all to be had by this means. The immorality is too great and somehow contaminates the prospect of getting meaning from the activity.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I want to talk about death and meaning in life, whether or not it contributes to it or detracts from it. And I think I'm interested in it because I don't know what to do with this element of time, of immorality, immortality, right? Because part of me thinks that if nothing I do lasts, if nobody ever reads my works, if they're all forgotten and destroyed in a fire, that would be pretty sad, you know? Like I would just, if I knew that ahead of time, I'd just be like, man, what was the point of that? Like I did these things so that people could read my works and could appreciate my art or something.
Yes.
But that seems to mean, if that's the case, I mean, we're all going to be forgotten at some point, right? So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't like that prospect either. And yet, I look around and I'm still inclined to think that some lives are more meaningful than others, despite the fact that all lives will end, and despite the fact that all lives will be forgotten. So I look at the lives of Einstein or Nelson Mandela or Vincent van Gogh, and all three are dead. But still, I want to say there was some real meaning to be had by virtue of their accomplishments. Perhaps there would have been more meaning. Maybe there's more meaning the more they're remembered, and the greater the positive impact after they've died. I think that's right. But I wouldn't want to say there's no meaning whatsoever by virtue of them having died.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that either. But do you think that it detracted from their meaning, though?
I think there are two different issues. One is, would they have had much more meaning had they lived much longer? That's one question. The other question is would they have had much more meaning had they had it had that would it have been the case that they would never die? And those are two different ones. I'm pretty confident in saying that if they'd had more time, and we assume similar kinds of resources and relationships and the like, that they would have had even more meaning in their lives. And I'm rather dissatisfied with the prospect of 80 or so years on the planet. I would like quite a bit more, supposing it didn't impose costs on the next generation for me to stick around. But accepting that isn't yet to accept the stronger view that that our lives would have a great meaning or be maximally meaningful if we never died. And that's, I think, more tricky. A lot of my colleagues, when it comes to that question, think that boredom is an important issue. And often the claim is, well, we don't want to live forever because eventually we would get bored, and boredom is in some way incompatible or undercuts meaning in life. I haven't found that a particularly compelling worry. I think we could take a pill to overcome boredom. It's open to technological fixing that mental state. In addition, I think it's possible to be bored but still perform meaningful activities. So hypothetically, if it's a matter of me being bored to prevent other people from being bored, I think there's meaning there. Again, there's a kind of sacrifice kind of argument to make. So what worries me more about the prospect of immortality is not boredom, but rather repetition. If we live forever and we never die, then it looks at that at some point we're going to be performing, if not exactly the same activities, then very similar ones. And there are two possibilities there. On the one hand, we remember doing it, and on the other hand, we don't. And on either one, it's unattractive, right? Remembering doing the same thing again makes it less rich. Um, um, on the other hand, if we don't remember it, then it's as though we're Alzheimer's patients, telling the same story over again. And that's not attractive either. So I still don't know what to say in the final analysis about the possibility of a repetitive life. But I do think repetition undercuts meaning in some way, and it's something to take seriously.
I see that there are two different questions, right? Which is one, can living longer contribute to a more meaningful life? And the other is, does immortality, contribute to a more meaningful life? And I can see that perhaps at some point you're just living way too long, and that actually takes away from the meaning. Like what you said is just going to be very repetitive. I think about, like Martin Luther King Jr. and him getting assassinated, right? And I feel like, I imagine, oh, he would have done so much more if that hadn't happened, and he would have lived a more meaningful life, and, and other people would have benefited from it. And so that's why I think that it kind of detracts from meaning, but that's assuming that you're actually doing something with your life to begin with, right? And it at least gives you the possibility to live a more meaningful life. And I agree with you, 80 seems too little. I want to live at least twice as long, assuming that I can do so in a relatively healthy state, right? Whether or not I want to live forever, I don't know. But fortunately, that's not really an option. It's just like a philosophical puzzle for us to think about. So I want to get your opinion on whether or not meaning is objective or subjective. I think you have some sort of hybrid view, correct?
Something like that. It's not quite the hybrid view that most of us are familiar with. So the standard hybrid view comes from Susan Wolf, who says that meaning arises when we are subjectively attracted or love what is objectively attractive or merits love. And if either one of those is missing for her, there's no meaning. So if you do what's worth doing, but you're not into it, you're alienated from it, then there's no meaning in her view. Conversely, if you're really enjoying something, but it's not objectively worth doing or worth loving, no meaning arises. So you've got to have both. And there's the hybrid approach for her. I don't buy that. So I think often being subjectively attracted would enhance meaning. So I think it's a contributory factor, but I don't think it's necessary. And the kinds of sacrifice cases we've already discussed in the past 10 minutes or so, I think are good counterexamples. So in this case, let's have another one of not me being bored so that others are not bored, but think of someone like Mother Teresa, who is nursing people with leprosy, or just a plain old nurse dealing with, stench and filth and agony and distress and severe illness. I don't think meaning in those activities depends on them enjoying the activities or liking them or being into it or loving it. I don't think any of these sort of positive subjective states is necessary. And I sort of, to be a little more controversial, if we imagine Mother Teresa sort of skipping around cheerfully amongst people dying from severe diseases, it looks out of place. There's a kind of somberness that's appropriate, which might be incompatible with subjective attraction in the way that Susan understands. So I don't think subjective attraction is invariably necessary for meaning. Often it would enhance it, but there are some cases where it looks out of place.
Yeah. So let's think of an example. So I was forced to play the piano and violin when I was a child. Okay. Hated it. Absolutely hated it. I don't know if that contributed to meaning in my life or not. What do you think?
You didn't find it meaningful. I think we have to admit that. But it might well have been meaningful to some degree by virtue of engaging your aesthetic intelligence, your creativity, and your sensibilities. I think it would have been more meaningful had you been into it and you liked doing it and yourself been engaged by it. Happy to say that. And certainly that's the hope, the rational hope on the part of your parents was to get you to that state where you would want to do it or willingly do it or at least find it meaningful. You know, I think there's probably some meaning in it in the same way that I think that often getting an education can be a source of meaning in life, even if we don't find it pleasant. Education is generally painful. We have this image of great teachers sort of stimulating their students, but you know, education is hard work. There's a lot of work that's being done by students on their own, and it's painful to grow intellectually. Even so, I think there's probably some meaning there in avoiding grossly false beliefs or unjustified beliefs about the nature of reality, and hopefully taking on some accurate or well justified beliefs about it. Again, the mental state. Ideally, we want it positive, but I don't think it's essential.
Yeah, I think that kind of parallels my view on well-being. So I'm kind of like what I would call a partially holistic objectivist theorist. So I think that there are certain things that are good for you. It's not necessary that you think that they're good for you or you have any pro attitude toward those things, but having a pro attitude toward those things enhances their well-being contribution, right? Likewise, you can have a pro attitude towards something dumb like counting blades of grass, and that would contribute a little bit to your well-being, but it would be even better for you if that activity you were engaging in were objectively good. So that's how I kind of see well-being. And maybe that's how you see meaning.
Generally, although, yeah, I think something like that's right. Look, I don't want to say that being subjectively attracted to something like counting blades of grass gets you any meaning at all, though. I don't believe that. It might be a source of happiness, but it's going to get a meaning score of 0 from me.
I see. Okay, yeah. So there has to be that, it has to be that objective component there. Yeah, I'm wondering if it's interesting. I think my intuition has changed depending on the details that we build into these hypotheticals. So let's say when the person is counting blades of grass, it's an aesthetic experience for them. I can't understand it, right? It just looks dumb, right? But for them, they're just like the way that they're placing the blades of grass, maybe, you know what I mean? For some reason, it's an aesthetic experience. Like, would that change your intuition in that case?
We still need more details for me to be able to judge. So if it's literally merely an experience, then I think, well, that's the kind of thing that's possible in an experience machine. And no meaning is possible from within the experience machine. So, things that are simply sensory, for me, are going to overlap with animal lives, more or less. That's rough, but simply having the experience isn't going to be a source of meaning on my view. But if the person took the blades and created something beautiful, well, then we start to find meaning.
Okay.
And even more meaning if others find it beautiful. I think that's fair as well.
Okay, so for you cannot get any meaning in the experience machine. It can't just be a subjective experience. Interesting. Okay, let's think about that a little bit more. What about people who've had deep spiritual psychedelic experiences after they take some mushrooms? right? They
Mm.
experience like ego death or something. You know, the way that it's almost a transformative experience. The ways, the accounts that I've heard, they're hard to understand because of how um like I don't even how foreign they are and how spiritual they are.
Yes, it's a good case. I think I would want to distinguish between the experience on the one hand and something like self awareness or self knowledge on the other. And I'd want to say the experience could be, I think the reason we're inclined to say that it's meaningful is that it would be meaningful as a means, not as an end. That we have that distinction as well when we're thinking about meaning in life. It's perfectly open to me to say the experience as such wasn't meaningful, but it was meaningful as a means to something that did have inherent meaning or non-instrumental meaning in it. And there I'd be inclined to say something like self-understanding or self-awareness is a good candidate for meaningfulness. It involves an exercise of one's intelligence. And so if taking shrooms were to lead to that, it'd be meaningful as a means, even though that experience as such would lack meaning, inherent meaning or non-instrumental meaning, on my view.
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, I haven't experienced this personally, so I don't understand it. I've only heard of other accounts. I wonder if this is not necessarily, I don't know. I don't know if it falls under self-awareness or self-understanding. I get the impression that there's some sort of connection that they feel to the universe. There's like they feel everything is connected, and for some reason that kind of addresses their fear of death. So I don't know if it's an intellectual thing, or like a emotional thing. And does that even matter for your account?
Well, I don't want intelligence construed very narrowly, right? So when I think, I reach to Aristotle and Kant and I'm thinking about rationality, I'm not thinking about, it doesn't have to be, sort of theoretical reason or it can involve aesthetics for me, for example, or decisions. And I also want to say that emotions can have a kind of an intelligence about them. And I do think emotion involves judgment, where the judgment is sensitive to our deliberation and our awareness. And so I'm open to the idea that certain kinds of emotions would count as, if not knowledge, at least intelligence. And so I think, I think things like sympathy, feeling sympathy for others is an exercise, a kind of exercise of intelligence. We're aware of a being distinct from us, and we are contouring we're contouring our feelings towards what we apprehend to be going on in the other person. This capacity is rich and complex. Maybe apes can do it. Maybe there are a few handful of other animals capable of it. But it looks like it's, the domain of intelligence to be able to do that. And so I want to count that as a kind of intelligence and a source of meaning. And so if I apply that model to the kind of case you're discussing, it could be that it could be a candidate for meaning. Again, I would want to know more of the details. Is it true that we're all connected in this way, or is it simply an illusory experience? I think the truth of it would make a difference for me.
So I'm wondering, in just going back to kind of like the nature of human beings and persons, us as like kind of self-conscious, rational beings, us being the rational animal. I'm wondering if there's this other dimension that is either ignored or it's subsumed under the rationality part, which is spirituality, right? I don't often hear academic philosophers, at least in the analytic tradition, talk about spirituality. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess I'm not even sure how I would define that term. But perhaps like this transformative psychedelic experience touches upon that realm. And so it is inappropriately categorized under rationality. And so perhaps like, so let's say there's some sort of hierarchy of being, but let's say, you just have like automata, and I don't know if we want to say that insects are automata, but let's say there's something like that, right? They're just reacting to, impulses and stimuli and stuff like that, right? And then you have like the animals, and then more higher animals, and then eventually you reach us. But what if there's a step above that? What is the step above rationality, right? If there were some sort of species that was everything that we had plus something else, would then therefore be, like, would that connect to meaning more? Like what's the relationship between that and meaning?
Yeah, I don't know. When I
Because
was,
I'm willing to grant that we can live more meaningful lives than cats and dogs. I'm willing to grant that. Since I mean, maybe it's speciesist of me, but I'm willing to grant it. It doesn't seem like their lives can be that complex. It doesn't seem that they can sacrifice. They're not like planning. They're not making plans. The theoretical rationality is limited. Their practical rationality is also limited, right? So it just doesn't seem like that their lives can be that sophisticated. And for ants, even more so. So I can see some sort of hierarchy of being in that sense.
yes,
And I just know, I just want, maybe we can just like push the boundaries even more. Maybe there's something above
yes.
us.
So I think it's fair to say a lot of spirituality is going to come down to or consider or include an awareness of other agents in an imperceptible realm. So it might be God, or it could be angels, or for a number of indigenous peoples around the world, it could be ancestors. And if we say the heart, or at least a chunk of spirituality, is being in touch with imperceptible agents, that looks like a good candidate for meaningfulness, right? If loving persons or being just towards persons can be a source of meaning, well, then why not certain kinds of positive relationships with this entirely other realm of persons? I'm open to that. I mean, again, it would need to be the case that those things exist. It wouldn't be enough just to think they do, and think one's relating to angels where there are no angels. But if there were ancestors and angels and God, and if some people or some type of being were particularly good at tapping into them, that looks like a good candidate for meaning to me.
Yeah, speaking of ancestors, I think that might be a good example. So they existed in the past, and they exist in our memories. And I know that certain people will have altars for their ancestors. And I'm less of a sentimental person. So I'm not really a person who would do that. Like I don't really feel the need to, visit my grandma's grave, for instance, right? But for some people, it's important to them. And I wonder what you think about that in regards to meaning. So would you say that that is a meaningful activity?
Well, a lot of those who believe in ancestors believe the ancestors are still alive. They're not embodied, they're not human anymore. But the spirits continue to exist, and there are different cosmologies about where the ancestors might be. In the African tradition, which I know best, having lived in South Africa for about 25 years, ancestors are here on Earth, and they're often identified as residing in a certain type of animal, or in a certain landscape, or at a gravesite, something like that. So if they're still alive, that's then it's just a different kind of person, and a different way of connecting with them in a positive or constructive way. I don't see any qualitative difference then. I think it's tougher when we imagine that those who lived in the past are dead. They've died along with the deaths of their bodies. The metaphysics here get tricky. I myself am inclined to think there's no more relationship, because there's no relatum to relate with. But I have other colleagues who think it's still a relationship. It's a continuation of the relationship that was initially had with the embodied living being. And that latter view would be interesting, and make it easier for me to accommodate the case.
I was imagining a secular understanding of death. Like your ancestor's gone, and yet you still visit the grave.
Okay.
It's interesting. I'm at the point where I feel like I can acknowledge that there is something that I am missing,
Mm.
by observing how other people behave, right? Like if I see somebody do that, I think to myself, there's something there. There's something important there. And it's not just random, and I'm willing to admit that that activity gives them more meaning in life. And the fact that I don't do that or don't have that detracts from the meaning of my life, all else equal.
I'm less inclined to call it spiritual at that point, right? So if we're talking about spirituality, it's normally associated with some kind of imperceptible realm, where we've still got agents of some kind, or some kind of force in the karmic tradition. So I'm not sure I would use the term spiritual there, but what I would say is there's love. I mean, to visit your grandmother's grave when she's really gone, it's a way of being loving still in respect of this person. And love is a quintessential source of meaning in life. So I think it's perhaps we can make sense of it that way.
Yeah, they're like expressing love, right? And perhaps that activity is meaningful. So the last question that I have is what you think. Again, I'm going back to just like what this concept of meaning is and how it relates to these other things that we deem typically to be good. Okay. When I think about the relationship between morality and well-being, I generally think that they are two separate things, but that they often go together. So if I were to just give advice to people on how to, live their lives, it wouldn't be that complicated, right? It would be, just try not to hurt other people, right? Like that's one thing, try to do what's good for you too, right? Do what you think contributes to your well-being. Try not to hurt other people. And most likely those two things I think, will be harmonious, that they wouldn't conflict, So the examples that I give my students is like, okay, yeah, I mean, so let's, think of, some immoral thing. I don't know. You're just like giving false promises, or you just lying to people left and right. You're a con man, or anything like that. Like that is not going to be, realistically, that is not going to be good for you. Being a really selfish person, realistically, is not going to be good for you. So I think realistically, the virtuous person and who lives a virtuous life is also living a life of well-being. Now, would that be the case when it comes to meaning and well-being, and meaning and morality?
Look, often they will align, but you yourself used the case of jumping on the grenade earlier, and that looks like a case of something that good candidate for a meaningful activity, but it's not good for you. And then we also have the case of Gauguin. We've spoken about not good to the wife and child to ditch them and go off to Tahiti. But looks like some real meaning came from it. So I think often they will align, but not always. I think, but I would still give the same. I would want to add to the advice, right? So do what's good for you and do what's good for others. But more than that, do something that would make you proud of yourself, or something you could esteem, or something others could admire about you and would speak about in a eulogy upon your death. That's another dimension, right? That's another kind of value, another way of thinking about your life. We can think of it too in terms of, I think it's important for philosophical categories to map onto psychological ones. So I'm inclined to think that happiness or subjective well-being is going to map onto issues of desire, satisfaction, or pleasure. There's certain states that we share with the animal kingdom. I'm going to think of immorality in terms of guilt. And so if you tell somebody do the right thing or do good to others, what you're implicitly saying is avoid behavior that merits guilt. But another looks to me fundamental motivation for typical humans is to strive for something that merits esteem or pride in oneself. It's just a different kind. I don't know whether it counts as a drive, but it's a different kind of motivation, and it looks fairly ingrained and widespread amongst the humans. And I think that's where an awful lot of meaning seeking goes. Doing something that merits esteem or pride or admiration from a third person perspective makes a lot of sense to me as a distinct kind of value, one that often aligns with the others, but they can pull apart.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to mention the concept of the eulogy, because that does come to mind as well, right? Like if you were just living a life that was good for you, that would be weird to kind of note that in a eulogy, right? It is about living a life that was admirable, having done stuff for maybe other people, for humanity, right? Pushing the bounds of our understanding of maybe like science or something, right? It's not supposed. It's supposed to be selfless. I feel when I imagine a eulogy.
I wouldn't put it quite that way. So again, I think there are different aspects of the self. And the lower part of the self is going to be the part we share with animals, the desires, the pleasure. And that doesn't go in the eulogy. But there are other parts of self-relation that look higher to me. So imagine somebody who had a lot of integrity, wasn't tempted to deviate from principles that person held reasonably or sensibly thought were correct, even if they weren't. It's a reasonable account of integrity, I think. That need not involve treating others certain ways. Doesn't have to be a grand advancing justice or discovering great truths that are shared with the rest of the humans. It might just be a certain kind of consistency in the way one behaves. And I could imagine a kind of respect for that and something to mark and note at a eulogy.
Yeah, like maybe this person was a cop and this person was like always a bribe, but never took the bribes. Just like, yeah, this person was honest. And yeah, just had a lot of integrity. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So then that would, for me, fall under the circle of virtue then, right? So then this kind of makes me wonder, it's like, is meaning a function of morality and well-being? Or is it really just a separate dimension? Is it really a Venn diagram with three circles?
I do think it's probably some kind of higher order good that includes other goods within it. I think, central to reflection on meaning in life is not happiness, or at least not subjective well-being. Instead, we've had for about 120 years, the three recurrent themes are the good, the true, and the beautiful. So if you look at the literature by philosophers and theologians and people in the ballpark, those three recur when they're thinking about what makes life meaningful. The good here is roughly morality, but it involves beneficent relationships. So family, friendships are going to count. The true doesn't, or inquiry, you can imagine a formal degree, some kind of higher education, but as we mentioned earlier in our discussion, even self-awareness or wisdom would plausibly count. And then the beautiful is going to be creativity. And we naturally think of the arts, but a good sense of humor or, cultivating a garden, writing some poems, having a good sense of fashion, these kinds of things also seem like sources of meaning. I'm happy to accept that the good, the true, and the beautiful are themselves distinct goods, right? I'm happy to say the art object is good for its own sake, that there's some kinds of epistemic value, and obviously morality has its own, or beneficent relationships have their own value and their own logic. But it's useful to categorize them, to bring them together under this heading of meaning. And to say of all three, for example, well, these are central sources of what merits esteem in a life. Where these are central respects in which you can achieve a purpose higher than your animal nature. or these are ways in which you can make a contribution or have a really compelling life story. There's some unity to those lower level goods, I think.
Yeah. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity to engage. I found it meaningful.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.